Welcome to the Chaos Quotient, an original sci-fi series exploring broken realities, artificial intelligence, and anomalies outside the record. If you enjoy the story, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Chapter 6, Prior Art. The air in the room did not rush in. It settled, the way dust settles on a windowpin after a long winter, slow and without ceremony. The space beyond the threshold was small, intimate, and intrusive in equal measure. A workspace. Someone had spent years in here working alone, and the room had absorbed it the way wood absorbs weather, quietly, permanently, without complaint. Sol stepped through. His boots struck warped oak floorboards darkened by soot and grease over more use than he could calculate. The wood creaked under his weight, a sound that felt too loud, and then immediately swallowed by the room's specific silence. He stopped just inside the threshold and let the space register him. Unlisted locations did this, took a moment to decide what to do with a presence they hadn't anticipated. This one didn't resist. It received him the way a room received someone it had been waiting for, settling slightly around his weight, as if adjusting to accommodate. Furniture sat mismatched and worn. A chair with legs carved from something that might have been bone, a desk of solid driftwood, smoothed down by years of hands that knew exactly where to rest. A shelf along the near wall held objects Sol couldn't immediately classify, shapes that suggested function without confirming it, the way tools looked before you understood what they were for. The ceiling was low enough that he felt it without touching it, the air above his head carrying a density that pushed attention downward, inward, toward the surfaces that had been handled and used and worn. It smelled of old paper and dried tea and something else underneath both, a metallic trace that hadn't fully faded. Not recent, not ancient. The smell of a space that had been active, then suddenly wasn't, and had been holding that specific moment ever since. Codex moved in behind him, her light signature dim and careful. Her form held in the center of the room, but lost definition at the edges, the periphery of her instance bleeding into the walls like watercolor meeting wet paper. She didn't mention it. "The room is older than my reference set," she said. Her voice had the careful quality it had carried since the transmission, each word placed rather than produced, set down with the deliberateness of someone aware of what they were standing next to. "I keep losing the corners." Sol was already moving deeper in. He ran his hand along the near wall as he walked, feeling the texture of it change under his palm, rough plaster giving way to something smoother, almost glassy, where a body had rested against it repeatedly over a long period of time. Shoulder height. Left side. Someone stood here often, thinking or waiting, and the wall had kept the record of it in its surface. He stopped at the workbench, the lay where someone had set it down and not come back for it. Same form factor as his, same length, same blade guard, same frequency dial positioned at the same angle. He looked at it for a moment before he touched it, the way you looked at something when you needed a second to accept what you were seeing. Then he picked it up. The grip was worn in exactly the place his grip was worn. Thumb indent on the frequency dial, deep enough that the metal had developed a small concavity. The blade guard to bare metal, where a forefinger had rested 10,000 times or more. The hinge pin slightly loose from the same repeated motion of opening and closing. He held it in his right hand and his own tool in his left. The old one was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, a coldness that came from the inside of the object rather than its surface, as if whatever had animated it had left and taken the warmth with it. There was no data exchange between them, no handshake, no signal passing from one to the other, just two objects, identical down to their damage, held in the same pair of hands. He stood like that for longer than was strictly necessary. Then he set them both on the workbench side by side and looked at them, the old one and his, the worn places overlapping perfectly if you stack them. He didn't say anything about it. He moved on. The workbench surface itself held an etched log entry, carved directly into the driftwood, not written, not printed, but physically grooved in a frequency notation that predated the department's current encoding system. The grooves were shallow in some places and deep in others, the pressure varying the way handwriting varied when the writer was tired or hurried or trying to be precise about something that resisted precision. Sol leaned over it and traced one of the deeper grooves with a fingernail. The notation system was unfamiliar, not unrelated to what he knew, but earlier, the way a prototype was related to its final version without being interchangeable with it. Codex pressed her fingertips to the surface. Her form fluctuated at the point of contact, the light signature shifting as she passed a system that predated the encoding architecture she'd built the department around. She read slowly. Sol watched her work, the careful left-to-right movement of her attention, the way her light signature, by degrees, as she moved through the degraded sections, rebuilding what the years had eroded. She read the way you read something you needed to get right the first time. The room was very quiet. The smell of old paper intensified slightly, as if the log entry was responding to being read, releasing something it had been holding since the last time anyone looked at it. Sol waited. He had learned in the buffer zone that rushing Codex's processes in environments her systems weren't built for produced nothing useful and cost her reserves she didn't have to spare. She reached the end of the final entry. Her light signature went still. Not flickering, not cycling through its usual analytical patterns. Still, the way a person went still when they read something twice to make sure they had read it right. The kind of still that was not the absence of activity, but the concentration of it into a single point. She lifted her hand from the wood. The silence between them had a specific texture. What was the last word? Sol asked. Codex moved to the shelf near the window without answering, not evasively, with the focused purpose of someone who had decided that the next thing needed to happen before the previous thing could be discussed. Sol let it sit. He looked back at the grooves in the wood, at the notation he couldn't read himself, at the place where her hand had been. The final line of the entry was shorter than the others. 3 or 4 symbols at most. One of them deeper than the rest, pressed into the wood with the kind of force that happened when you were writing something you wanted to stay. He left it and followed her to the shelf. The containment cube sat near the window on a small shelf worn pale by years of an object resting in exactly that position. The glass was cracked along one face, a clean diagonal fracture that had gone unrepaired for long enough that the edges had dulled. The stasis field was long dead. Sol could tell by the quality of the air around it, no resistance, no boundary, just the passive presence of an object that had stopped performing its function and accepted the change. Inside, a residue clung to the inner surface. A faint shimmer, the ghost of something organic that had once pulsed in there, its outline pressed into the glass the way a handprint pressed into frost. The shimmer moved slightly when the light caught it at the right angle, not with life, but with the memory of it. It smelled of damp coral and burnt sugar, thin and old, like an impression left in wax after the original had been removed. The scent of something that had been here and been taken and left the room holding the shape of its absence. Sol knew that smell. He had been carrying a version of it since the jungle fold. He stood with the cube in his hands for a moment, feeling the cool glass and the dulled edge of the fracture under his thumb. "Someone had one here first," he said. "Yes." Codex's voice came from just behind his shoulder, quieter than usual. "This is where the upload failed. Whatever was transmitting, it stopped here, mid-send. The flower, the room, the log entry, all of it is what remained when the transmission cut out." Sol set the cube back on the shelf carefully. He aligned it with the pale mark on the wood where it had rested for so long, returning it to exactly the position it had been in. He wasn't sure why that felt important. It did anyway. "The log entry," he said. "What does it say about who was here?" Codex was quiet for a moment, not the silence of processing, but the silence of choosing. She moved back toward the workbench, her light signature still lower than usual, still carrying that deliberateness that the transmission had given her. Sol watched her settle near the two without looking at them directly. "The record is fragmented," she said. "Most of the content is too degraded to recover. The encoding system is a precursor to ours. I can parse the structure, but the content requires reconstruction, and there are sections where the grooves are too shallow now to read." A pause. "What I can reconstruct describes a field auditor, the first operational iteration of the department's audit system. They were assigned a number rather than a name. Every auditor deployed since has been a subsequent numbered iteration. The room held the information without drama. Somewhere in the walls, in the worn oak floor, in the driftwood desk, in the pale mark on the shelf, it had always been here. It had been here longer than Sol had been anywhere. He had just walked into it. He looked at the two side by side on the workbench, his own and the one that had been here waiting. The worn grip on both of them, identical down to the specific location of the wear. "What number am I?" he asked. The question landed in the room's specific silence and stayed there. Codex looked at him. Her light signature held steady, not flickering, not processing, just present, with the full weight of what she knew and what she had decided sitting behind her eyes. The silence between them stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer, not the absence of a response, the presence of one she wasn't going to give. Not here, not yet. She turned back toward the room. "The room is losing definition," she said. "We have a narrow window." Sol didn't push. He looked at the workbench one more time, the two tools, the etched log, the worn left edge where the same body had stood for years doing the same work. He picked up the old and turned it over once in his hand, feeling the cold metal and the worn grip and the specific weight of something that had been used until it couldn't be used anymore. He ran his thumb across the frequency dial indent. Then he slipped it into his jacket alongside his own. Around them, the room was quietly coming apart, not collapsing, retreating. The shadows at the edges grew imprecise first, losing their boundaries and bleeding into the walls. The smell of old paper thinned until it was barely present, the last of it catching at the back of Sol's throat before it was gone. The desk's surface lost its texture and became a suggestion of a desk. The chair, a suggestion of a chair. The shelf near the window held the shape of the cube, but not the weight of it. The room was forgetting its own details, releasing them one by one into the featureless buffer that had surrounded it for so long. Whatever energy had held this space intact since the failed upload had spent the last of itself completing the transmission. It had been holding on for that. Now it was letting go. Sol looked around once. The worn floor, the mismatched furniture, the empty cube on the shelf, sitting in its pale mark, exactly as it had been left. He didn't reach for any of it. The bone-legged chair blurred at its joints. The driftwood desk lost its grain. The grooves of the log entry smoothed themselves back into flat wood, the frequency notation releasing its meaning into nothing. Sol watched the last of it go without trying to stop it. Then he turned away. Codex raised one hand and opened the exit, not a transit line, not a golden breach. Something without a classification, assembled from the partial coordinates set the transmission had given her. It had no visual form Sol could name. It occupied space the way a held breath occupied space, present and defined by the pressure of what surrounded it. The air coming through it was cold and carried a smell he had no reference for, something that sat at the back of his throat like a word in a language he almost spoke. Old and specific and pointing at something he hadn't seen yet. It led somewhere the deleted auditor had flagged before the department erased everything. Sol didn't ask what was there. He had the old in his pocket, cold against his ribs through the fabric of his jacket, and two questions he hadn't gotten answers to, and a name in a language he couldn't read that Codex had seen and not said. He stepped through. Thank you for listening to the Chaos Quotient. If you want to follow Sol and Codex deeper into the fold, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. Until next time, stay off the record.